We're
We're,
recording, guys.
we're live and we're recording. Okay, guys,
Yeah.
it's Kevin Wadsworth and Patrick Crone from NorthStarBadCharts.com, and we've got a great guest with us today. We've got David Murrin. David, would you like to
Yeah.
introduce yourself?
Yeah, it's great to be on the show, guys. Well, I mean, my history in this area goes back a long time to the first day I walked onto a trading floor at JP Morgan as a physicist by training, thinking I know nothing. And I'd encountered Papua New Guineans and watched this collective behavioral pattern years before in the jungle where they all shared their emotions collectively. They were charged like a capacitor and they all wanted to kill me. I was a long way from anyone to save me. So I went through this baptism of fire, which is another whole story. But what is interesting is having survived it, I watched them literally discharge their emotions collectively and then go back to work. And that fascinated me, that individuals could charge other individuals, their emotions charged like a capacitor, and their threshold of individuality is low enough to share it. And over time, they forgot about it and they became your friend 6 hours later. 6 hours before, they wanted to eat you. 6 hours later, they'd talk to you. Anyway.
Sounds like the crypto market at the moment, yeah.
Well, yeah. There's an awful lot of people who won't be talking to their Bitcoin soon, before it goes up again, I might add. And then I joined through hook or by crook the floor of JP Morgan. And as a physicist, what do I know about finance? So I looked around that trading floor and I looked at the economists, because surely, you know, they were the shamans of our modern time and they knew what was going to happen. And more I realized they really didn't know what was going to happen. It was some kind of giant con where essentially they spilled out bullish news. The trend was upwards and they looked as if they knew what they were talking about. The real issue was whether they could pick a trend change, anticipate anything that was non-singular directional. They couldn't, systematically. Some of the guys from the foreign exchange could, and they came from the East End, uneducated, had an intuitive feel. And then I started to really be fascinated by predicting what was going to happen next. So being a good physicist, I thought, well, price, that's what it's got to be about. Why couldn't you quantify price, look at behavioral patterns? And for 6 months, I started developing my own systems. And then someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, you know, there's lots of stuff out there. If you want to be a heretic, go and have a look at it. So I did. And ultimately, I was shown through one of the guys already in New York, who was a generational wave counter, Andrew Baptiste, who said, look, you know, he actually did a wave count that struck me as fascinating. And I picked it up very quickly and I charted a Bank of England interest rate change. And they went from 0 to like 12% in a perfect 5-wave sequence. Now that is a challenging observation, that a central bank that's meant to be independent was acting like part of the collective of the all. And of course, for anyone who thinks that central banks are independent, you could put that one in the bin. They're just a bigger market participant, but they're a market participant none the same. And they do the things that the market does, belatedly, usually. But watching that 5-stage process and making a fortune out of it, that got me going. So since then, basically, I was one of the first prop traders there, first one to make money out of the process when no one believed it was possible. Set up one of the early hedge funds in Europe and became the first emerging market hedge fund, or one of the few. We were really successful in all sorts of dislocations. Funnily enough, like I found stable markets a bit boring, but any big dislocation, we literally creamed it. So at the top of the Asian crisis, we sold the top, bought the bottom. That took us to #1 in the world. You know, got the whole 01 to 03 thing. That was very successful. Made about 84% in 07 to 08. Made like 160% out of the flash crash. So big dislocations, big stuff. And I learned over time to also live in between and make money too. But that's, you know, sort of 25 years of being a CEO and a risk taker. And I decided in 12, I'd actually created Breaking the Code of History about 6 weeks after 9/11. And that gave me this whole construct that what if something was happening in our society bigger than price, and that we couldn't see the price data of a 500-year empire collapsing? What would be the signs? Because I really felt that 9/11 was essentially a moment that wasn't accidental. It was a failed immune system response by America that allowed the terrorists to act because 2 intelligence services competed rather than shared, which was a hallmark of decline in my mind. So I started to think, well, what if I need to construct a cycle, which is, we don't have the price data, but you extract the price data from a cycle of up and down and create the core processes that you see, the emotions and behaviors linked to price, and then create a model which is the 5 stages of empire. And I did. And then I started to rummage through history and I was gobsmacked. I use wars as the clocks of empire. And you know, you'd be looking at the Egyptian empire thousands of years ago and did exactly the same things. Kings did the same things. And that was when I realized I'd stumbled into something. Every empire I found in our history went through these cycles that were quantifiable in behavior. And so breaking the code of history became the 5 stages of empire. And there were all sorts of other problems initially, which was the Western Christian empires from the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, essentially had very shorter durations than 350, 400 years of a normal cycle that you saw. So, of course, I kept thinking it's got to be technology, shortens the cycle, makes it more complicated. And then it dawned on me that actually, if you used a meme of Christianity rather than a national entity, we had the same level of cycles. So it's a religious meme that bonds the Western Christian world, and the nations are the pistons within the engine, and they may change, but the system basically performs the same processes. So regionalization, the first stage of empire, was a Catholic process, highly linear, highly controlling, really a land power in essence. And along came this revolution of lateralization, which was the Protestant beliefs, which liberalized, connection to the divine and thought. And the 2 Protestant powers were the Dutch and the British. And lo and behold, they had very high ratios of coastline to internal volume. So they highly lateralized societies. So the sea was a natural place for them, where they created disproportionate power for their population by using sea power as a leverage. And that was the greatest expansion of the Western Christian world through those Protestant dynamics, which happened to be meritocratic because they were linked to the sea and therefore begat greater levels of democracy, which the land powers then followed in Central Europe. And watching that cycle unfold and understanding how it worked in a way that you don't really see was fascinating in itself. But getting to the point of recognition that America was the last of the Western Christian empires, it went into decline in 9/11. And the book predicted the past 20 years of behavior of America's decline and the rise of China, and also the coincidence of World War III linked to the next Kondratiev cycle in 25 onwards. And I was talking about that 20 years ago, warning people how it would play out. And we're now in the final act of that play, and unfortunately badly prepared. But if you look at the markets, and we'll go through some charts with you, I look forward to that, they also show very similar patterns. And one of the things that's really interesting when people say, how can America have been in decline for 20 years when the stock market just made its high in Thanksgiving? It's really simple. Is in decline, what do? You have no productivity. So you leverage it by printing money. And printing money moves all the assets through the roof. So that's why you see this disconnect between the stock market and the point at which that 5th phase of empire, which has declined, started. And that also means that this peak that we had in Thanksgiving is not just a peak, it's the peak of the American financial system, of the super Western Christian empire. And what follows next is the greatest financial dislocation we have ever seen. It's essentially 1929 squared.
You're scaring me, David.
Well, I did warn you, nappies were a prerequisite of interviewing me.
And,
wow.
I took a few notes. And it's crazy. But I'm super happy that I've been talking to Kevin a long time, because the British accent, it's tough. I'm a French Canadian, and but David, man, it's man,
you know
so
what?
much
You're pretty
research.
normal for a Quebecois. Well done. It's very impressive.
And it's I told Kevin I have the perfect excuse. When I fumble my English, I blame my French side, and when I fumble my French, I blame my English side. I'm in a no-lose situation.
That's an excuse I don't have. If I fumble my words, I'm
You're screwed. Yeah, we're both screwed.
David, you mentioned World War III. Is there a time do you, like, when that's going to be, like, or is it happening now, or it's in like in?
So through the so there are 2 types of conflicting agencies. So in the cycle of empires, war is not just war. So the first war you encounter is between regionalization and expansion to empire, and it's a civil war. And basically, it's where the system lateralizes. It removes linear leadership. It has a civil war. By the end of the civil war, the whole system is lateralized, because lateralization is strategic competence and military competence. It's peacetime armies are linear, wartime armies are lateral. It's the human adaptation of the highest level of competition. So civil war removes linearization with a few people at the top, replaces it with a lateral structure, and it militarizes society. So the English Civil War did exactly that. And by the end of it, we were tooled up and ready to go. And the first thing we did was have a go at the Dutch. And it started the Dutch Wars. And, we took on the Dutch. And once we took on the Dutch, we took on the French, and algorithmically expanded. So where are various countries in the world right now in that process? Britain is the only country in the Western Christian world which is in the second stage of empire, because Brexit was our civil war. Now, it has some problems. It has some advantages. We didn't kill each other, which gives hope to mankind. It's the first time expansive energies ever been contained without warfare. But we didn't complete our lateralization process. So we end up with a highly lateralized prime minister who basically has no other balancing qualities, and that itself is a problem. We ended up with a person who wanted to change the civil service in the form of his, compatriot who was kicked out, but he was so out there that he was never functional and able to do it. And now we have a government that's stuck in the linear world, was never changed, and they're ineffective. So we're sort of half pregnant, very badly half pregnant right now, in trying to get to the stage of being lateralized and adaptive. And one of the reasons why Boris won't survive is he's fundamentally incompetent. Forget dishonest, it's incompetence. And systems in expansion demand competence. And that's really what Britain demands right now, competent leadership, in a way it hasn't done for a long time.
But the greater risks, I guess, will come with, the European Union is what, the United Kingdom broke away from successfully to an extent. And part of my thinking and relief about that was that it meant that the United Kingdom wasn't necessarily tied to the financial malaise that was likely to befall the European Union over coming years. But the European Union is made up of a lot of countries, of course, and if they begin to fragment, and if the United States starts to feel its position threatened, which it is already, no doubt, with China, Russia, Brazil, and rising economies elsewhere. You could probably bring Africa into that in years to come as well, I dare say. But I think it's quite clear to a lot of people that the United States and its role as global reserve currency is under threat. So how do you see, China and Taiwan, obviously tensions there. What do you think are the probabilities of being able to negotiate all of that over the next decade or so without some kind of nuclear conflict?
Okay, so lots of questions. I want to try and remember them all, Kevin. So, so under my 5 stages of empire process, Europe has passed terminal decline. It's demographically negative at its core. No system have ever sustained agglomeration with a negative central core. So it's finished. And thanks to Merkel, she extracted every ounce of the German empire into, if Merkel had been an agent for Putin, you shouldn't be surprised. At every step, she disabled every outcome for the worst case. And the EU is a bankrupt, broken, non-productive system, and only American protection, military protection, enables it to survive, has done in the past. And the worst thing is, with zero productivity in high inflationary environment, it's now dead. And escape and getting in the lifeboat from the Titanic was the first element of it. What's interesting is that Britain didn't do it as a doddering old man that fell in the lifeboat. It did it as a much more vigorous choice of sovereignty, expansion, and the great hope for the Western world. And I know I'm not sounding pretty rah-rah, but it was a bit of a shock because I created these signals of national energy that saw systems rising. My favorite one was Olympic gold medals, because you need national energy to fund it, to work with it, to create competition. And you can see every great power rise through the medal tables in the past 100 years. And suddenly there was Britain in 3rd and 2nd. That wasn't a coincidence. And that was a hallmark that Britain's national energy was driving the change you talk about, Kevin. So much as we left this collapsing system, we are now an independent system that is already making a difference to the world. And however it was that Boris came to the decisions for his own survival to support Ukraine, the net effect is we saved Ukraine by providing 4,000 NLAWs before anyone else. We had a vaccine program which basically got to the program before others, thanks to going to the private sector. We are showing hallmarks of that lateralization, which are really exciting. And at the same time, we've ignored low taxation and stimulus. We've ignored defence. We've ignored core issues of addressing problems. So it's a tantalising lollipop of what could be with great leadership. And then on the other side, you've got America that is really in terminal decline. They've got themselves a socialist president who's the most linear president in history, who was incompetent when he was young and linear, who's just totally unable to meet any challenge as an old president. His route from Afghanistan was a pilot war signaled for aggression from Russia and China, without doubt, that Ukraine is a direct product of Afghanistan and a perception of weakness. Now, they were already weak, but that just triggered the Act Now process. And next, we've got to deal with Taiwan. And the Chinese are going for Taiwan. Make no mistake about it. I wrote a book called Red Lightning, and one of my areas of study has been the great military balance to do with empires and the military balance today. And the problem is that American carriers cannot be protected against hypersonic warheads that the Chinese have put on the DF-21s and 26s. So we're talking about it. I don't think the US Navy can get to Taiwan anymore. So some sort of surprise attack from container ships, out come the missiles and drones, and all of a sudden we've got South Korea being invaded. It's imminent. This isn't 5 years, 2 years. It's any time going forwards.
Wow. So that could be classified as world. That's not World War III yet.
No, I personally believe we already started World War III.
Okay.
It's very simple. America and Britain are at war with Russia. Whatever words we use, we provide real-time intelligence to the battlefield. We direct Ukrainian forces. We train them. We put our special forces on the ground. We give them our weapons. We give them economic support. America has a Lend-Lease program like it did to Britain in 1940. What part of that isn't a war? Now, Hitler knew that America was at war with Germany long before he declared war because he didn't want to really. But American destroyers were fighting German submarines for almost a year before Pearl Harbor took place. So so we're in the same situation, and the mistake we're making in not acting like we are at war, I call it the phony war. At least in the last phony war, we were preparing for war. Now we're being deluded by our politicians. We're not at war, and that only begats greater aggression. So I think we're in a horrible deck of cards, which when you couple with the financial situation we're in, which is I call it the doomsday bubble because there's no way out of it. And I was able, and I'll show you on a chart, how I was able to call the precise high in the NASDAQ based on a fifth wave extension. Now, fifth wave extensions are what happened at the end of bubbles. And once an extension completes, you're going back to the beginning of the extension. And the first target is the lows of 2020. But the real target is the lows of 07, 08. That's where we're going in 2 years.
So, I mean, that ties in. I've had conversations with Patrick and looking at ratio charts and ratios of the stock market to gold or the stock market to various commodities, energy as well. And some of these ratio charts, I kind of look at them and I kind of can't believe them because the projected path seems to suggest lows on the stock market and or highs in certain commodities and precious metals that most wouldn't believe. And when I look at those ratio charts, I think, well, what's going to happen to make that? I mean, a little bit like you, I have techniques for projecting what's going to happen into the future. And in 2019, I drew a gold forecast that played out to pretty much perfection, and even to the extent of a point in this year where I suggested the gold chart would break out, but I didn't know why. Of course, Russia invaded Ukraine, and I went back to that chart, and it's happened before multiple times that I'll draw a chart and project what's going to happen, and the fundamental background, what's happening in the world around us, I don't know what's going to happen in 2 years. I don't know the details. It sounds like you have got a lot better handle on that than I do, certainly. But it's incredible how, when you are able to pull the evidence together, and there's multiple ways of doing that. You're using Elliott wave. I'm using a sort of weight of evidence technique to sort of narrow down likelihoods and probabilities. But the number of occasions where world events fall into place to kind of confirm what the chart was telling us was going to happen years previously, and what you're talking about here is exactly the same thing, but it's kind of confirming my worst fears, having been looking at the charts for years and scratching my head thinking, well, is this fourth turning, the Great Reset, all those kind of stuff, these terms that people throw around to basically explain almost like a coming doomsday, as you've described it.
Well, it's a doomsday for the West if we don't wake up, but it's not for China, because China's the rising system. So if we go and look at the things that I would say influence my perspective, it's the end of the Western Christian world, which is one hump, and the rise of the Super Asian empire, Japan being the first system and China the second, now in its second phase of expansion. So I knew that we were talking about conflict in that window. And so how does that look like? Well, there's never been a peaceful hegemonic transition, period. So it's not going to be a peaceful with this one, because the hegemon always wants the hegemonic challenger always wants it quicker than the hegemon's prepared to give it. So conflict ensues. So conflict isn't random. Conflict is commodity price linked. So the Kondratiev cycle is really fantastic for this. The peaks of the Kondratiev cycle, the last one was 75, the peak of the Cold War. And indeed, I can model the whole of the Cold War on a Kondratiev cycle based on the USSR being a commodity producer and the West being a consumer. And of course, at the peak of the commodity cycle, what do you get? 15% CPI, consumer society almost drowning, and the communist system looks really vibrant, looks unbeatable because it's producing commodities. And then the roll downhill of commodity prices, consumerism picks up, and then you end up with Ronald Reagan, where you can use that money to harness it to create better weapons. And meanwhile, the Soviets with their fixed army basically are supporting something you only use for a war. And the great thing about navies is they create enterprise and they create returns through trade. Armies are just like a fixed cost if you don't use them. And the net effect was bankruptcy. The last time we had a peak like that was 1914. And 1914 was a hegemonic challenge from Germany to Britain. And then before that, the American Civil War, and before that, Napoleonic Wars. So we're coming into this moment, which is 2020, I put it to 22 to 25 a peak, because I moved it slightly further forwards, that essentially conflict through commodities would trigger this hegemonic moment. Now, for Russia, it's different. Its bellicose approach comes through the wealth of the commodities, and as commodities produce wealth to its treasury, the aspirations of a Putin, not of a system because it's got the worst demographics in the world, Putin's aspirations have found manifestation through the wealth of the commodity cycle. Now, they're not an expansive system. We didn't have to go to war with him if we did it differently. Through our own blundering, we made him and put him on the other side of the fence and shoved him next to the Chinese, which we now can't encircle, and we face two entities. That's to do with Western failure of politics. Didn't have to be that way, in my opinion. No. But we are now facing two allies, the perfect pair. One produces commodities and one uses them, and they have a land interlinkage. One has more ICBMs than the other has more manufacturing. We've built a nightmare partnership, and I don't believe Ukraine was random. She knew all about it. We're pretty aware of the fact Ukraine was 2 weeks late because he didn't want it over the Olympics. Funny enough, it doomed it then to go down roads in the early process. They couldn't get off the roads because it was boggy. Then the in-laws worked. So Xi's request had huge knock-on effects in terms of the initial failures. But this isn't some adventurism that's going to stop. At the moment, he's adapted in Donbass. He's concentrating artillery. He's winning. The West is apathetic, and it's sort of just basically, we'll think we'll bleed Putin, but please don't use nuclear weapons on us. We're sending more signals of our weakness. Everything we do at the moment is making the situation worse. And underneath it, you've got the same Kondratiev surge in the sea wave, which we can draw for you, essentially, which has triggered this inflation problem. But it isn't an input inflation problem like it was it isn't purely Kondratiev anymore, because there's two other elements. One is we gave all our manufacturing to the Chinese, and now it's coming back in our face, which is just so structurally nightmare. It's like all the inflation we suppressed is coming back at us. And the next problem was America printed all that money. And that money is a dam waiting to break in psychology. So it's inflation, which has meant the Fed can't control and print anymore. And this next breakdown is about central banks' failures, inability to combat inflation through its three reasons I've mentioned. It's a proper nightmare of asset collapse, high inflation, no growth. I mean, it's the perfect Weimar Republic on steroids.
But now I was going to do a joke. What can Canada do to help? Like Canada, can't we beat China's for the US? We have commodities. We could help out. Right?
No. You guys are looking really good. I'm telling you, there's something really interesting about Canada, which I gotta say I'm impressed by. You ordered 15 Type 26 frigates from the UK, right? They're not frigates, they're bloody destroyers at 9,200 tons. And you shoved every single weapon onto them you could to make them all-purpose ships. I have to say, that's more forward-looking than the Royal Navy, who've got like a partial solution of a few. And it shows that somewhere in the Canadian government, there's a recognition that you need a Navy, like you're the third biggest Navy at the end of World War II. So that legacy kind of endures. So I always think that's interesting when countries make those decisions, because somewhere in a dark office, someone realizes that a storm cloud is coming towards them and they need to do something about it. And Canada and Australia got big ticks for that in comparison to Britain.
Man, I'm realizing, David, that I was looking at my silver charts or gold charts that had 100 years of data. I'm realizing I don't have enough data.
Well, you know what's so interesting you say that, because that's what I felt when I created the 5 stages of empire. I needed context. I felt there was a tidal wave coming, and the data we had was a radar which didn't see it, the magnitude of it. And because it's once in a lifetime of an empire, how could you prepare? And so breaking the code of history was my solution to that. And I really wish I could say it's a load of crap and it's been rubbish and a total failure. What I'm really alarmed at is how phenomenally predictive it has been. It's scary. I mean, I predicted every US election, every UK election using its algorithms for 20 years. It's like it's just pulled apart human psychology.
There's a thing in meteorology and weather forecasting that weather forecasters are always advised, don't ever predict a record is going to be broken. So if you're forecasting it's going to be hot tomorrow and the record is 38 degrees Celsius, don't forecast it's going to be 38.5 or 39 degrees Celsius, because the chances are you're going to be wrong. It's very, very rare for a record to be broken. And I find, parallels between that and, economics and financial forecasting, because there seems to be an inertia that it's kind of somehow seen as, you're wearing some kind of tinfoil hat if you even try to suggest that society is going to do anything other than move towards some kind of perfect future world without this kind of as you say, sort of turmoil of empires, and this turmoil as one empire falls and another one rises. It's almost as though we have to consign that to history, and that can't happen again. And I just question where that comes from.
So we are sitting here as people who are visual because we use charts. We're lateral because you think differently about it. So to us, asking those questions is actually in our DNA. And we express our individuality in different ways in our life. You wear your hat back to front, but we do other things, right? So that's a joke, by the way, in English. A joke.
It's okay. It gets far worse from me, honestly.
Okay, so the interesting thing is, I think there are a whole group of theories on my site, from the theory of anti-entropy about how we create social organisms to push back the entropy of the universe by creating these empires, to the theory of human collectivity, which talks about the fact that we are not all the same. 70% of our civilization thinks laterally, so linearly, and 30% laterally. And it goes back to the old hunter-gatherers who were lateral, the people who lived by the sea, versus the agrarians who became more linear. So we have a symbiotic construct. If you had a world that was stable, you want linear people to run it because they just love running something that goes on straight lines. If you want a world that's highly adaptive, you want lateral people. And in some combination, you mix it. So what happened when, after 9/11, America learned the art of printing, is they created stability through the printing of money. And the printing of money created the illusion of stability for 2 decades. And that meant all the structures in our society are led by linear people who think they've got a handle on it, whose political skill sets trump their ability to anticipate change, because there isn't any. They've thrown all the mavericks out as irritating carbuncles, and the systems have no adaptive voice. So literally, it's like I did a piece about Maverick and Tom Cruise. We all love Tom Cruise, but the parallel.
I saw the film a couple of days ago. It's great.
It is. Well, when you watch it a second time, you must go on my site, because I wrote a thing about we need more Mavericks. And essentially, the story of Maverick is an institutionalized Navy that becomes more linear. One man, Iceman, who sees the uniqueness of Maverick's skills and keeps him in play. The moment he dies, the linear person says, you're fired. Not for any reason, but you're just a pain in the arse. He stands in front of his pilots and says, I've got my cunning plan. We'll go half the speed down the valley. And he does it with such confidence. And the pilots turn around and say, but then we'll die. It's like doomed. And he just doesn't understand it's doomed. He's just far more keen to get control of the system and sit there and say, I know what to do. And he doesn't. And it's such a brilliant construct because it's a microcosm of how we're being led right now. The people in charge who think linearly think they understand what's happening, and they have not a clue in the wave that's hitting us. And in some ways, I think that entropic events, as I call them like this, are about forcing human adaptation. Now, they come from the outside in natural events, but biggest entropic events come with a rising empire challenging a declining system and sweep it aside because it's failed to grow anymore. And unless we force, by social engineering, an advanced, accelerated lateralization of our leaders and the people advising them, we are dead meat in the West. We have months and a few years to survive.
David, is there a way to break this cycle? Because I'm wondering sometimes these incompetent, or let's say the the economists who don't look at charts, who don't understand, they're causing, with their excesses, they're causing the eventual downfall. But is there a way where the economists, they get...
Okay, so let's take a fractal of an individual's human growth and awareness. Okay, so most of us are born in, some state of completely unaware. We're locked into our parental patterns, we're repeating them unconsciously, and we're doing destructive things, but we think we're doing constructive things. We're up to the limits of our conditioning and our cycles. And then suddenly we start to realize, and we become more aware of ourselves, usually through abject failure or rejection or some emotional disaster, which takes us to a point of breakdown and re-examination. And then we start to rebuild ourselves with an inner awareness, and that awareness changes our patterns. So if you use an alcoholic is really an unhealthy person until he reaches a 51% awareness he's an alcoholic, at which stage he realizes who he is. And then he starts to realize he's addictive and starts to address it. So the human system as we know it is not at 51%. It's like really well and truly below 50%. It has no idea about how it keeps repeating its patterns over and over again and the self-limitation they impose. And when I offered Breaking the Code of History, I offered it as a construct of collective awareness. For us, I was given it through a route which I think is fascinating. Somewhere I was, whatever it is, and my desire was to share it as a self-help book for the collective consciousness of our society, so we could get through it. And I was well aware that this decade, with this Kondratiev cycle surge and conflict, actually, I think is a decade of consciousness or catastrophe for the whole of our race as we face World War III, which could annihilate us. And we either wake up and get to we will go to the precipice. The issue is whether we get through that precipice. And I'd venture that in a universe full of planets, that every race that becomes sentient must go through a stage where its technology can destroy it unless it becomes self-aware of its own patterns. So I don't think this is actually unique to us. It's unique to any sentient system, and it must be fascinating if you could travel the universe in spaceships, like that you could do with the Enterprise, for that moment of pre-warp where you're looking down at unconsciousness before they get through it, and then you can be.
That must come down to the individuals with their fingers, sort of on the buttons at the time. The Cuban Missile Crisis, we came very close, didn't we? And that moment in history, everyone looks back at as a point that could have caused massive
and others like it, Kevin, where individuals have represented a radar blip as being a mistake rather than an attack and actually not responded to it. But I do think that they are still all part of it. I do think this whole connectivity that we have is a quantum connectivity in a way that's difficult for us to yet understand. And so although it looks like an individual at a point in moment, they represent all sorts of interconnections with the whole system. And that makes us one giant organism in effect. And we are but voices within it, and a subset of it. But unless we realize, for me, how this pattern plays out at the rate we go, certainly the West won't survive. China might survive, but we won't. And I don't think China plans to let democracy survive, because it's spent its whole life crushing it in every single form. It's shown it in the Uyghurs or Hong Kong. It's systematically destroyed democracy of 6 generations in 6 months. And that's because they've developed systems that would work in the West too. So we're fighting for our very survival and values in this period. And our politicians have been paid off by the Chinese to turn a blind eye. We've been inveigled. There's all sorts of dynamics taking place.
Surely that's an unsolvable problem then, because if the Chinese really will not allow any form of, and we all know what Chinese society looks like today, and they're sort of records on human rights and all the rest of it, and the lack of democracy in Chinese society, and if they have a will to impose that or bring that to other corners of the world, and the same for Russia, then that sort of taking over of their role as empire leaders in the world, how can that sort of jive with the continuation of Western society? I mean, the two can't coexist. Is that what you said? The two can't coexist. So it's either we give in or we all get blown to smithereens.
Kevin, it's mutually exclusive. The trouble is that as Putin has learned, and he threatened the West with nuclear weapons and a limited construct, which was, we'll use a limited nuclear weapon somewhere in Ukraine and you don't know what to do with it. And then it'll escalate. And we should have fronted it out like we did in Cuba, because now we live under this whole cloud. When you're threatened, the West backs off. And that's a real problem, because our weapons of last resort are just that. And if there is a perception that we don't have the intention to protect ourselves by risking our lives to live, we don't survive. We just end up going to servitude in the hope, like many did when the Nazi jackboot arrived, that it wouldn't be as bad as they hoped. Well, it will be. There will be no Western individual. Our kind of conversations, the lateral people in our society, will be the first people whose genes disappear, because they do not want anyone but a compliant system. We are fighting for our values of freedoms and democracy, just as Europe did against Germany under Hitler. It's no different, except for they're better organized. They're far more formidable than even he was.
And far greater weapons at his disposal. Don't know if Pat wants to bring up a chart of maybe one of the stock markets.
I don't know, man. This is so interesting. It's like, who cares about charts, man? It's so much fun listening to David.
I mean, I'm not an alarmist, and I am fundamentally an optimist. When people will laugh, but the conclusion, as we talk about, Kevin, is inescapable when you look at the weave. I mean, so to give you an idea of things that I look at, which will give you, because you want to talk about charts and evidence rather than I think. So the first thing is I've got my empire curves, which have been incredibly predictive. They are more intuitive than quantifiable, but once you understand them, you would find them understandable. And it let me predict every stage of Brexit as a lateral linear conflict. Who is going to do what? How it would happen? It's just fascinating. So that's one big picture backdrop. The next one is the Kondratiev cycle, which is really quantifiable. It's basically, it represents itself in oil, and we can pull up a 20-year oil chart and I'll show you what it looks like. It represents itself in all of the grains and some currencies. So you can see that Kondratiev cycle, which is the drumbeat of conflict.
You know what?
That's the K-wave cycle, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm curious. Sorry, guys. I'm curious for that. So maybe we could close up. I'll share my screen, and David could guide me.
Before you do, I'll just give you one other bit I want to do, and then you can take me wherever you wish to. Sure. Then inside, so Global Forecaster, and I'll tell you why I did it. So I came having given back money in 2013, thinking I don't want to fight this printing of money process. I promised I would come back when I thought the end was nigh and do something. So in the middle of 19, it went, oh my goodness, the time has come, David. So of course, I reached for, let's set up another hedge fund. And then I had a moment, I thought, well, investors don't let you speak to people because they like to keep it all secret. And if I make lots of money and the world ends, that doesn't really help. So I can't do that. I'm dyslexic. And the reason I wrote a book and overcame my dyslexia was for my children and our children. So I wanted what I did next to be consistent with that. And now I had breaking the code of history under my arm to see that I wasn't just someone who used charts or was a directional trader. It was something completely different in piecing together human behavior. So I decided to set up Global Forecaster, something completely different. It has 3 arms to it, and it does it in different ways. So the first is I shared my real-time geopolitical predictions, which are extensions of the book. There's 10 years of them on the site if you want to go through. I never take anything I put on off. It talks about all the predictions, all the theories. I've made all my concepts available to people because that's one of my drivers. Now, people pay for Murrinations at £50, but literally it's worth much more. It's investment grade insight into how the world of geopolitics works. And then there's lots of podcasts like this where I give away a lot because, again, it's trying to get people to wake up. And that's all on the site. If you sign up, you get alerts for it, first thing. So it's really a body, and most of the people who come are lateral. You'll tell at this stage we're at the beginning of the cascade, but that's beginning to change. Then the next bit is essentially a hedge fund. It's a hedge fund that covers 80 macro markets. It basically buys and sells. It tells you real time what to do, how much you put on, when you do, and it tracks the alpha points you make. And that means anyone who takes risk can then tap into it and convert it into their portfolio. And it's phenomenal. Over 3 years, it has spat out alpha in the most remarkable ways. Picked highs. I've learned a system whereby I can pick a high and then manage it as a trend. So we're super max short the NASDAQ, 1% from the high, and the stop was 1%. And we're now like 40 times the multiple of return from the risk. And there are tons of them like that. Now, I saw the bond market, but I didn't get on it, so I'm not getting points from that one. I think gold, we'll talk about. There's a washout to come. It's not a straight up thing. Bitcoin, sold Bitcoin at 66, stop was 68, still short it, maximum size. That's been a perfect Elliott wave. And I think it will go to 100 after everyone has been killed. So that gives you some idea. And the third one is an advisory portion. So basically, think of a business, and I always think about this. They can have a board, and surely on your board you want someone who understands a macro perspective of the world. Because if it's 1 or 2 risks a year, what you do with your interest rates, being hit by a pandemic. And by the way, I was able to predict the pandemic on the 5th of January. Every one of my clients knew it was coming, because in breaking the code of history, I'd predicted the next global pandemic would come from China, come from a weapons laboratory, and be part of an asymmetric weapons program. And when I saw it in Wuhan, I knew exactly what the symptoms were of it. So it's about understanding things before they happen and seeing the signs once you understand. And why would the Chinese do that? Because they're involved in a hegemonic challenge, and they're going to be seeking asymmetric advantage. So of course they're going to be developed biogenetic weapons and every form of weapon that they think could give them an advantage. That's what hegemons do.
And no doubt the seemingly senseless lockdowns in China at the moment have a lot to do with that, because they've got very few cases and very large sections of society are being completely locked down, which makes no sense at all.
So I have a theory about it, and it's interesting you touch on it. So there are 2 parts to it. One is I do not think it was an accident, and there's a whole paper I've written. You can go to the website, and we were able to predict the onset, the end of it. Like the 3 waves that were significant, the 4th in Omicron that wasn't. Honestly, it was like watching something you knew was going to happen next. Why people found it confusing is beyond me. The lockdown story in Wuhan is interesting because it was designed to make the West lock down. Wuhan was a unique place. It was in the middle of China. You could isolate it. And it was basically saying, you need to be as disciplined as us. And if you do it, hey, guys, you can be like us. And of course, what do our people do? We do it and we copy it because that creates economic constriction, which was the purpose of the pandemic, to create economic constriction, shove debt through the roof. I mean, we can't spend it on weapons and defense. So we couldn't have an arms race if we tried. That's what it did. It was brilliant. And so the legacy now, I think they were initially able to inoculate their population with a non-fluorine cleavage versus all that spraying in the streets and stuff. I suspect was an initial program, but the subsequent waves that come back to them, they don't have the solutions for, which is sort of why they're doing what they're doing, and the dogma in a combination, and the supply chain constrictions, which I don't think are accidental. So there's a number of pieces of that puzzle which are not ones that we perceive in the way that probably reality is over there.
Fascinating stuff.
You can read it. There's plenty more evidence to back up what seems to be big, bold statements. It's all on the website. Anyone can download it.
We're going to put the links definitely of your website in the description, so people could right away they'll see it. They'll be able to click and definitely there.
I mean, lockdowns were a fundamental error.
Yeah.
And I wrote about it before. it wouldn't stop transmission, and B, it would kill our economies. And the evidence from Sweden is overwhelming in terms of the difference of 2 systems. And again, I think that was linear politicians seeking power rather than paid off politicians. It was just a way for them to get, that's how they think, power control. And Gove was a really good example of that. I call him the Lord of Lockdown in this country. And you had the same over there and in other countries, same characters playing the same part in different play.
Yeah, I agree. I want to see now I'll share my screen. I want to see the oil chart, the Condraft cycle.
Okay, let's go right the way back to 2000 dead. Okay, that's great. Right.
Move drawings.
If you go back to 2000, where's 2000? At the bottom of 2000. Yeah, okay. So this is when I first got into Kondratiev waves, and I thought, oh my goodness, that's a low of Kondratiev in 2000. And we started buying things like Russian oil stocks and Lukoil at 64 cents down there, which we sold at $64 a bit later. Now that surge from 2000 to the peak in 2010, you see that big spike, right? That's the A wave of the Kondratiev cycle. The move from that peak down to the low in 2020 is the B wave.
I don't know if this A. Oh, no, it's numbers. A, B, C, D. Could I do this? Okay. A wave.
Yeah, A, and then go down to B in the 2020 low.
B.
No,
2020 low.
2020 low.
All right.
Because I'm going to show you some interesting things about the way this Kondratiev cycle works. Okay, that's B. And then I want you to put C somewhere like twice the height of, you put C at 350, that's where C's going, and I'll show you why. Okay.
You don't care about log scale, right? You want me to put it on log scale?
No, just for this. Just it's easy for this. Okay. Right now, I'm going to go and expand that for you a little bit more. Okay. So take the C off. Don't just squiggle with that. Right. Okay. Now, if you look at the A wave, the A wave is in 5. Nice 5-wave surge.
Sorry about that.
Okay. So what's interesting about the B wave is the B wave is in 3. It's it's basically an A triangle B and then a little thrust down with the C. That's the deflationary portion of it. And that was given a really big kick by just the deflationary structures that the West created through initially the perception of low interest rates and the manufacturing base going to China. And I was writing an awful lot about saying if we don't make friends with Russia in that period, when Russia and Putin is feeling vulnerable, there will be hell to pay. Now, oh, that's nice. I really love that. Okay, because I'm going to show you the next bit. Right. So of the 5, so we're now in the C wave, which is the most horrendous part of this cycle. So if you go from the B and you go up to where we are now with 5 waves, and you go one up to where we are now. Okay, that should be 1. Okay, now go down back to $50. 2. Stop there. Now go all the way up to 260, maybe 280, would guess. Okay, stop there. Then come down a bit to 220, and then go up to like 360. Right, that is what commodities will do over the next 5 years, if I'm right. Now, the reason why we're about to get the wave 2 drop is because as equities collapse, and you already see it, there's a demand collapse that goes with it. And you're seeing it in all commodities. Everyone talks about inflation and food security, but the truth is they're all doing it at the peak of a wave 1. They're all that's when their attention's grabbed because it's a 5th wave of a 1, and it's big enough to get the attention.
All right.
So now we're about.
So the B to C, this is a fractal within just the B to the C. This it's going to subdivide into this move, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, got it.
Right, and now the reason why you're looking at you get 2 is the demand collapse, and then where do you go when you've collapsed your assets, and essentially inflation is high because I think it will be the process that we're going to face then is the competition of resources as conflict takes place between the West and China, and that's what's going to drive the 3rd wave. And that 3rd wave is going to be like nothing we've ever seen. And I'll give you an example, is that the Cold War peak of 75 was Russia as a commodity producer. There will be some ratios on this. I've got a more precise version, but I wanted to give you how this is kind of panning out. And so essentially the process that we've kind of got here is not like 75, where you had a Russian producer versus a Western consumer. That only produced a peak of 15% CPI on input basis. It's much more like 14, where you've got Germany and Britain seeking the same resources, or the Napoleonic Wars, and they made much bigger highs, inflationary peaks, without the added process of competition, money spending, and all the other things. So I think this is going to be a massive peak, and if we're smart, this dip lets us if you're a government, this dip is the one where you build strategic reserves, you build capacity and resources, and you realize your warning was the peak of wave 1. However depressionary it feels, that's when you need to, and that's your generational opportunity at the bottom of that cycle to look at resources in a completely different way.
This one here, 2?
Yeah, 2. But believe me, 2's going to leave no one with any money, which is the problem. Yeah. It's going to be so destructive as the stock market collapses that essentially one of the other reasons
do you see the commodity complex suffering as much as general equities during that 2nd phase? Look, there
initially I think so, because people have overweighted themselves thinking they're immune, so they're going to get a real kick in the teeth. It's a little bit like I'm hugely bullish gold, silver and platinum, but I think we're going to wash out first before you want it, and it's really brutal because the smart people have all got it, but it'll flush out because of this perceived demand drop, which will make people think inflation isn't an issue, but it really is bigger than you ever imagine. So, and also it's where liquidity is, and they'll lose liquidity in their portfolios, and it'll be one of the few things they can liquidate. So we're going to have a huge problem with that relationship.
Do you, are you, I'm sure you are aware of gold's sort of propensity to cycle through 8-year cycles, lows into the year 2000, 2008, 2016, and back, you know, you can take it back into the 1970s when you know, the gold standard was taken apart. So do you see any value in looking at the fact that the 8-year gold cycle is in 2024? Does that tie in with any of your thinking,
well,
or is that likely
if you pull up a chart, I'll show you, Charlie, show you sort of what you see. I was like you at a certain stage expecting a break. You know, I was working on the breakout. So I'll give you sort of some, and gold's been one of our, okay, so okay, so
the question that I have, just to frame it really, is, you know, I've been pondering for a while now whether gold is already declining into that 8-year cycle low, and whether we're going to break lower from here, or whether the recent breakout through the resistance line that Patrick might put on over the last 2 years, the 2-year resistance line, whether that will hold at around the 1800 level and have a final little burst higher to maybe $2,500 ahead of the 8-year cycle low, or indeed whether I'm just chasing fairies and rainbows trying to locate the 8-year cycle low at 8-year intervals.
Well, look, I haven't used the 8-year cycle, so I'm not really an expert on it, but I can show you what I see in front of me right now.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go
right.
Ahead,
yeah. And you see this massive, you see impulsive moves in gold and then sideways periods. That's his hallmark. Yeah. And this thing, so you can see, you know, basically this surge. Yeah, you got this impulsive up to that red line you're going to have there, and then you've got obviously a correction. It looks like 3 waves in the correction with a little triangle in the beetle location. And now we start another impulsive move. Now, I can tell you that impulsive move isn't finished because there's no 5-wave sequence in sight. But we are in something that's lateral right now. So if you could perhaps expand, you know, what that looks like, that, you know, around the D area, I'll show you why I think we're in for just a little bit of nastiness before we get the good news.
This is subdividing.
Ultimately, we're going up there. Okay, it's how we get there. I think we're going to 10,000, but that's over the next 3 years. But it's how you get there and your timing. If you could just expand this bit that where you're just dribbling now, I'll show you why I think there's a little washout to come. I say little, it'll really hurt, right? But why there's a washout. So on the left-hand side, prior to when the thing jumped up on that spike, you could interpret that as a triangle, 4th wave position, thrust higher. But the moment the thing got back below 1840, big alarm bells, big alarm bells. Because in a wave counting term, I basically have a 3 down from the first spike to the first low, just below your cross. Okay, shoot. So if you just go to the left there, which is a good point, go to the red one on the top left, up a bit, left there, that's a bang, right? Click that one. Go down to the major loads. That's it. Bang that one. Okay, that's in 3 waves. Now go to the spike up here. That's in 3 waves. And now I want you to go and just go down below the last lows to 15. Bit more. There. Stop. Okay. That is what I think we're about to do. And the reason is the thing up until that spike is in 3 waves. So we have a 3-3, which means we've got some kind of 5-wave C wave. And so far, we've got 2 1-2s, which are like down sideways. Platinum looks horrible. Silver's got similar qualities. So I think there is a washout that takes us down through the lows. No one thinks, you know, that makes any sense, but it does do if you look at, you know, a demand drop, perception of inflation, and equities going down at the same time. And that's what you want to avoid, because it's a, you know, significant difference between, you know, where we were up there at 19, low of 15, and then a move to, you know, 4,000, which is a multiple difference. Silver could get to 16 and platinum looks the same. They just look like they got more sideways in their correction before the next impulse. And I know I'm in the minority. I love gold. I think ultimately it's one of the really great places you want to be. It's just about timing. So if I'm right, I'll be like, you know, the 1 in 100, and if I'm wrong, I'll be vilified as usual. But I feel comfortable.
Well, there's certainly a very clear support line, and Patrick's drawn it on there. It's that dotted line that is just drawn on, and we, you know, from classic TA, we've broken out of a bullish wedge there to the upside, and we're now back testing it from above, and that tends to be a bullish technical chart setup. But it's very clear that if the price breaks below that level around about, I think you mentioned 1840, we're maybe looking at somewhere between 1800 and 1830 on other evidence techniques, but that area certainly between 1800 and 1840 is key. And I totally agree with you. If that level fails, then we are going down some considerable amount.
I mean, I think it'll be enough to go and get the holders who currently own it to split the dummy, and then it'll just spike upwards. I don't think it'll be horrendous. It's just it's really like the double act of those that had the foresight but got in there too early.
And over the next, would you say, that occurring over the next 6 to 12 months or extending into 2024?
No, I think it's going to be quick. Do me a favor and pull up a NASDAQ chart, would you?
That's my favorite chart to bash on.
Right, because it's really the drumbeat of what's going on around us. Could you just go, like back to, just go back as far as you can. I'm going to show you just a few things, right? All right, so 89. All right, so
I
don't have older than that. I have SPX that has hundreds of years.
Yeah, let's do SPX a second. They're the same phenomenon.
Yeah, that goes back over 100 years.
Okay, this is really nice. Okay, so if you look at this at the top, the 03 drop is an A wave, the correction up to 07 is the B wave, and then the C wave is the 07-08 drop. It's a perfect fourth wave in effect, right? Perfect. That's it. ABC, love it, right? And what we've had from that fourth wave is 5 waves, of which the move from 20 to the Thanksgiving high is a 5th wave extension and the 5 of 5. And it's got an extension at the end of it. And that extension has all the mathematical properties of an Elliott. It's really staggering how accurately I was able to predict it. So the first place that an extension will go back to is its origins. And the origins of that extension are roughly 2.6, 2.3, the 2020 lows. So we know we're going down there. Now, if you can go and give me, so we're going back to the 2020 lows. How do we get there? I think we're going below it. Can you just blow that up for me a little bit? And I'll show you. That's the first one. So the A wave off the high will go maybe to 2000 or 2.3. Then we'll bounce and then we'll go all the way down to 600.
Wow.
I mean, you're talking about but that's what those waves represent. 5th waves, extensions, retracement. And if you think of the inflation environment that we're in with the contractive cycle, it just really fits. I've never seen so many things fit in a dovetail series of layers. I mean, in my whole career, none of it's ever made sense like it does now.
David, we've taken a lot of your time there, but when you were talking about that peak in 2008, I just want to mention to people that SPX measured in gold and US equities have peaked a long time ago, guys.
Yeah, and you know what? That's a beautiful way to say it. And so they should, because the real value that's unleveraged peaked a long time ago.
Right
All
here.
that we've seen is just leverage on top of very little growth or no growth.
There's nothing. This is
hot air.
It's just nominal, nominal values. If you take inflation out of the equation, you're kind of missing half of the point of it, because what's the point if seeing it going up nominally if it's not going up nominally quick enough to beat inflation?
I mean, honestly, it's
like being on an escalator going in one direction, but the escalator's taking you in the other direction. You can't run fast enough.
And what's interesting about money printing is you can only get to a certain number before you just can't make enough hot air to keep the shit alive. And we reached that, last year.
So okay, so we did reach it, okay? Because I'm wondering,
So just so you know, and because I did it real time, I called at 67.40 the all-time high that would take decades to go back to. That, and like real time, that's where it is. And I truly believe everything we've seen since conforms with that. Now, what we haven't had yet is the crash, but we're about to. Because if you look at the fall off the highs in Elliott terms, all you see is 5s down and 2s up and 3s up, which means they're 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And the middle, the third wave, is about to happen. We're the highest probability of an absolute extension to the downside right now.
It's David, man, it's so enlightening seeing your viewpoint, because we don't do a lot of Elliott wave at all. But when I liked you showing me how to trace it out, because I know now SPX or NDX, they're breaking down versus gold. And even on their own charts, they're starting to close below their 3-year moving averages, below important. So nominally they're breaking down, and adjusted for inflation, they're breaking down.
I mean, it's really interesting because I also track a lot of individual shares. So one of the things I was looking at was the Russell, but at the time of everything going, and I looked at the top 20 Russell shares by value, and I went short literally 50% of them. And I got 50% of them to get to 40% of their value when the Russell had hardly moved. And that was a leading indicator that it's like sort of ducks that you're shooting at, and they 1 falls and 2 falls, and finally there's no ducks left. And it was really instructive. The signs were there all last year. And that's what narrowness and breadth talk about. Breadth is lots of things, and narrowness is there's just one stock at the end of it, at the peak. And that we saw it, and no one talked about it in the way they should have done in terms of what was happening. If the Russell 2000 represented the core of America was dying, then, and more the NASDAQ was 3 or 4 stocks, and these anomalies like Tesla, you knew it was going to be dire at the end of it. But no one, and then the thing about this process is bubbles produce dopamine, and dopamine puts everyone to sleep. So basically, we are just beginning to see cortisol flow, because on the last low of the S&P, even a week ago, it was only 38%. I'll just buy some more dips. I'll just treble up. It'll be okay. And now we've gone through that. They're raising rates, and the Fed saying inflation is a nightmare. And my delusion is breaking. And, I'm reaching for the cortisol because I'm getting a little scared. And the reason why they're going to get a lot scared is I've never seen a marketplace with so many beta trend followers who think in a linear way, with the mavericks ejecting from the system, and they're in a death dive. And they'll all work out together. They've got to get out. And we'll wake up one day and we'll be 30% lower.
Well, let's just hope we have enough mavericks survive all this craziness to carry on at the end of it, because what you just described there, has so many implications, far-reaching implications that we haven't even touched on in this interview.
I mean, Kevin, I'm really pleased. I don't want to sound like I'm cheering for this or gung ho, because I love the fact you've touched on, and we can talk about it, because I am terrified for all the people that spend their life for their pensions that disappear, all the people that think everything's going to be okay and they're in trusted hands who are not. And the social implications are terrifying. And one of the reasons why I put myself so out there was to warn against this, in some hope that people might hear it, might adapt. Those that heard did adapt. They don't have portfolios, a lot of them, as a result. But I've really tried to make a difference and warn of that process. My products were based around the word arc, because it felt like it was build yourself an ark. Well, the deluge happened and everyone else wouldn't make it. And I think it is as severe as that. And I say again, I'm fundamentally happy. I'm fundamentally optimistic. I think you can get through anything, even the worst, but you do have to wake people up to collectively survive. So it's within that context that the evidence is overwhelming of the trouble we're in. And if that wasn't enough financially, what really scares me is our financial weakness means that our military ability to protect ourselves is disabled, because we'll be preoccupied with that at the time when we face the biggest military challenge since the end of the Cold War. So it's like a deck of cards, and our leaders are walking us into a very, very blind alley.
What we need is more voices like yours advising Western governments, David, and then we might, we might have more hope of turning this ship around. But it does seem as though, as you say, we're being led along a path that doesn't end particularly well, to say the least.
Well, in effect, it's a human way of removing an imbalance, and we have an imbalance of linearity and lack of creativity. So the way that the human genome system works is you wipe it out, and then the mavericks rise up from the ashes, and you start again. But the difficulty with the Chinese is the mavericks are the targets, because they're not allowed under CCP rules. So the Western Western societies are more individualized and more maverick, inverted commas, and Asian systems who are more collective. So actually, if you look at it from our human race's, crossroads, it's a crossroads for the human race, whether we're bound back into collective unconsciousness by communism, or whether we escape our democratic roots and this whole history we've been given of freedom by being prepared to struggle, fight, strive for it as it becomes tougher, as Ukraine is finding out.
Wow, a lot to think about there for everybody. It's yeah, I don't quite know what to say except thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, because your wealth of experience and your background are hard to come by, and I know both myself and Patrick are both very, very grateful that you took the time to speak to us, and we'll do our bit to try and spread the word and share the word, because I know myself and Patrick are also very well aware of these risks that lie in front of us, and we've spoken about them. I've spoken about them frequently over recent years, and I've put out videos, trying to get people to, as you say, wake up to what's happening around us. So we will put this out, and we'll get lots of people watching and hopefully spreading the word.
Well, I really was touched when you guys came forward, because you were price-based. I thought it's fantastic. No price-based people ever approach me as if it's some form of alchemy. Yeah. So I love that. And I love the fact that you suggested to use a chart. I mean, I'd love to do it again with you, because it's been great. Yes. And I'll bring on I'll show you some of the charts, because the way I annotate them and stuff will show you the complexity of how the probability unfolds. And
That'll be fascinating.
And really. I'll run you through why it is that I think the evidence, as you described, Kevin, is so layered. It's difficult to conclude anything but where we are, and it's so far created so many accurate predictions, and I really wish they weren't, but and it chills me to be the person saying it. And I would recommend, if you get a chance, go to the site, and there's a lot of information for people to learn this language. Anyone that uses a chart will be intrigued.
And the website is, David?
It's davidmurrin.co.uk. So MURRIN. And davidmurrin.co.uk.
Perfect. Can we find you on social media as well? The Twitter account?
Yeah, there is, and there's also a LinkedIn. There's the stuff of the stuff we're meant to do. Although as an old person, I'm gradually got used to. And please, just it's been great. I'd happily do one in a few weeks, and I'll do some charts for you. And I'll show you through some images and run you through, in effect, with a sort of question and answer, the 5 stages of empire, how the contractive cycle works, where individual things. I think by then we might be in a different world, because we're at the elastic limit of the stock markets right now. And
I'm really looking forward to that. It's always I love learning new stuff, and the viewers also there. So yeah, I can't wait for that. We'll put all your links in the description, and hope to talk to you soon again, David. True honor. Thank you.
Well, I've really been a privilege to speak to you guys. You're just great. I love your dedication, your work. And I've talked about my stuff. I'd love to actually find out more about what you do, because we can all learn from each other. So, it'd be great in the next chat.
Yeah,
okay,
awesome.
Great. Part two to come.
Ciao, guys.
Hey, have a good evening.
Thank you very much, David.
Take care.
Bye, David. Bye. Thank you very much.
Cheers.